What is up, everybody, and welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com. I'm Jacob Turner. He's Andrew Jones, and AJ, we're here for another edition of the UNC Football Show. Been a while since we've done a UNC Football Show. I know, and I'm going to use the word off-season in air quotes right now, because a lot of the times when, basketball ends, a lot of people, as a fan, you're in the off-season of Carolina football and basketball no longer being in session. But with the portal, man, it's just completely changed everything to where I even think our off-season dynamic as a site that covers UNC has changed. So What is the off-season for you now? Do you even have an off-season anymore, AJ?
Funny story. A very, very good friend of mine named Brian Hendrickson, who used to be in this business. We worked together at Star News. Brian left the business about maybe 6 years ago. He was actually teaching a sports journalism master's program at IUPUI in Indianapolis. And he texted me the morning of the spring game. And he said, "Hey, man, how's the off season going?" I'm like, come on, dude.
You just laugh.
Come on. Yeah. So the off season, it helps. This past week has helped a lot because you get through the draft. You get through the football portal. It closed Tuesday night. Basketball portal closed Wednesday night. Then RJ finally makes his announcement public, which we had to be on cue for, and trolled the world at 3 a.m. We'll get into that in the basketball show that we're going to do. Yeah, so I'm literally on alert. I've been on alert up until 2 days ago, like around the clock, essentially. And I talked to Adam Smith about it. Gosh, last week after before Mac's press conference, post-spring presser, and Adam's like, it's like we're doctors. We're always on call. And it's really like that. Now it slows down a little bit. I've actually done my walk. I started a walk the other day, getting my steps before 5 p.m. I had been doing most of my steps during the month of April at like 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night.
Sounds
because
right.
I know, what? Nothing's going to break now. I can go get my steps finally.
Yeah.
So the off season is here now, but we still work a lot, and I could scale down. We have a lot of content in the hopper that's been created, and we'll roll a lot of that stuff out. We have more than we've ever had before, so we're going to be really active on the site.
Absolutely.
But a lot of this stuff has been done in advance, so I can actually be a dad and a father and a
human being.
Again. Yes, a human being. I watched a movie with my wife the other night, and the movie started just after 9 p.m. So
good for you, man.
I'm
happy for you, to be honest with you.
Well, actually, it was a little bit later because I taped the Orioles because I can go through it quicker, and I don't feel as much pressure to get home by 6:30 and be in there watching them live. So we skimmed right through the Orioles game, and then I accidentally saw the final score on Twitter. Thanks to Josh Graham.
Sounds about right.
And, and so that's when we started the movie kind of early. So that was sort of an off-season moment there.
Yeah, exhale a little bit, relax a little bit. Yeah, man. It's again, this is with the portal obviously football closing on Tuesday night of this week. Yeah, you can kind of finally exhale a little bit for now. And again, things will happen during the offseason with the commits and everything. But again, at least we don't have to worry about anybody entering the portal for a while. So AJ, this will be a little bit quicker of a football show because, again, I don't know if anybody wants to listen to an hour-long football show in the middle of May. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think with the topics we're going to hit on, we're just going to kind of rifle through these real quick and try to keep this one around about 20 minutes, which, again, I think makes sense in the offseason because we don't want to, overanalyze too much stuff going on. But I want to start with roster retention. For me, both the football and the basketball program did a great job of that. I know we put a drop out on Thursday that you did talking about roster retention from a basketball perspective, but we haven't really talked about it from a football perspective. But I think when you look at it, man, Carolina didn't lose a ton of guys. I think a lot of the guys that, especially important guys on the team that could have maybe gone to the transfer, have decided to come back to North Carolina. And we'll talk about some additions in the portal that Carolina got as well a little bit later. But I think roster retention in particular has been very good for Carolina football. So do you feel like Carolina's in a pretty good place right now going into their offseason before, fall camp starts in a couple months?
I do. I think that they have a really good idea who they are. And as far as the guys they lost, DJ Geth told them before spring practice he was going. He didn't participate. And then Aiden Duncanson, who was way down the depth chart, went ahead and decided he was going during spring practice. So did Legend Cavazos.
Mm-hmm.
Max said going into spring practice, this was a real big spring for him. And clearly he had to make a move. There wasn't really going to be, or he was going to have to find another place to go if he wanted to play. So that happened. Then, of course, Tad Hudson, Michael Merdinger passed Tad Hudson the minute he stepped on campus.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not a criticism of Tad or anything like that. Merdinger's good. Merdinger throws a nice ball. He threw the nicest ball I saw all spring. So that's that. Anyway, again, not to be critical of other people in the room.
You just say how you see it.
That's who they lost. And Hudson landed at Coastal Carolina almost right away. Mm-hmm. The other three have not found landing spots as of the time that we're recording this. That's all they lost. They lost nobody that's going to affect the depth chart at all. Mm-hmm. They lost nobody that the staff had meetings thinking, well, we got to figure out a way to get this guy in the field. And that, again, they just weren't ready to help. That doesn't mean that they're not good players and can't help somebody else. So I don't think that there was any shakeup that adversely affected the roster at all since they got back from the bowl game, basically. Mm-hmm. So the stuff about Amarian, they did what they had to do to keep Amarian. To his credit, he didn't, from what I understand, didn't pay attention to any outside programs or people that were maybe trying to reach out and throw some cash at him. Carolina took care of him. He was very satisfied with it. He actually took part in some of those conversations himself. It wasn't just an agent. So he's good to go. He ain't going anywhere. So they know who they are. They still got a question at quarterback.
Yeah.
They got to figure that out. And they feel better. They feel good about the quarterback room. I'm going to reiterate as what I said last time you and I talked about it. I only saw them 3 times. And Connor looked pretty good twice. Mm-hmm. Max didn't look that great either those 3 times, but that was just 3 times. These people have seen him every day for 5 months now. Mm-hmm. So my opinion on seeing him 3 times is just a tiny, tiny, tiny thing. Mm-hmm. These people are professionals and Hall of Famers and NFL people, and they've seen him every day. So I'm going to lean on what they say, and we'll know in time what their quarterback situation is.
Yeah, it'll obviously play out during fall camp, and perfect segue into some of the guys that were brought in, which is what I want to talk about next with Carolina. Let's start with Jacoby Criswell, him being kind of the latest guy, and probably the most, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but I think it's probably the one that people, if anybody of the, handful of guys that they did bring in this portal period, I think he's the guy that probably surprised people the most, obviously, because he was at Carolina a couple of years ago and obviously lost out to Drake May. No shame in that when you just see Drake May getting, drafted as the 3rd overall pick to the New England Patriots. So completely understand why someone like him would transfer in the first place from Arkansas, which is where he went. Makes sense that he went back home to his, in-state school. Didn't work out there for different reasons. I know he had I can't remember the guy who was in front of him, but good quarterback in front of him. So getting a starting spot down there was always going to be an uphill battle for him. But Criswell coming back, and I'm going to direct people to the drop what you did earlier this week about Criswell, because I thought it was absolutely fantastic with the insight that you gave us in terms of, okay, why did Criswell choose to come back? And I know a big part of that was obviously the graduate school opportunities here at Carolina. But again, it also adds another dimension to the quarterback room. Mac Brown mentioned a couple weeks ago in a press conference that, hey, we need a 4th quarterback. And I thought the question you followed up with to him is, do you just want a 4th quarterback to have a 4th quarterback, or are you trying to bring someone in that could maybe compete and shake things up with that starting spot between Harrell and Johnson? And we talked about it in our post-spring practice pod, so I'm not going to go in depth on it. But Matt kind of saying, well, we need a 4th guy, but if you're interested in coming to Carolina, holler at us and could potentially start. So with the Criswell situation, I know graduate school played a big factor in that. Carolina's obviously a fantastic university for that. But I mean, do you see? I know you talked about a little in your drop as well, but do you see Criswell coming in and maybe competing for that starting spot as well, or maybe at least competing for a backup spot? Because I do think there is a lot of talent there, but it's a different trajectory with someone leaving and coming back. You don't see that very often, at least at Carolina, I should say.
I think one of the important things that you can learn through the portal is ultimately how kids view themselves and their futures in the sport. For example, Seth Trimble coming back was in part, and I don't mean to, I'm not going to speak for him, but this is my observation. That's him realizing, okay, Because as you know, Jacob, as I sidebar for a second, almost all these guys arrive in college thinking they're going to play in the pros.
Of course, yeah.
But reality gets to quite a few of them during the course of time when they're in school. And it's a good reality. It's a healthy reality because very few are ever going to play in the pros. It's better if a kid recognizes that and becomes a program kid and buckles down on his education and gets that and has the program experience and finishes and moves on with his life. Maybe you get an opportunity to play overseas in basketball, or if you're football, at least you go to a camp. I would imagine just even if you get cut, if you go to an NFL training camp, it's a hell of an experience you can take with you the rest of your life that very few other people have. So I think in Seth's case, I think there was a lot of reality about where he is as a player. It doesn't mean he can't become an NBA guy or certainly play overseas, but I think that kids come to realizations about themselves. My understanding is Jacoby Criswell has done that. He lost out to Drake. For whatever reason, whatever people can believe what they want to believe, that Mac oversold it as a competition or anything like that. Mac says it was a competition. It's hard to imagine that Drake was neck and neck with a guy who was third string at Arkansas.
Yeah.
So maybe at the time maybe Jacoby got to Arkansas and whatever people thought was going to come out in his game never came out. So the young man that is now going back to North Carolina is going back for the academics, is going back to strengthen that room. He loved the campus. He loved the program. So many of the same people are still there, and he's a good fit. And I think what Mac achieved here, and I think Mac has had a pretty good couple of months, to be perfectly honest with you. And he's been criticized regularly by people, but he set out on arguably the most difficult mission I've heard yet during the portal era. He announced to the world, we basically need a fourth string quarterback, but didn't reject the notion that if a potential starter were to reach out, would or wouldn't they not entertain the idea of bringing him in? Mm-hmm. He said it was open-ended. I asked him 2 different times, 2 different press conferences, and he gave the same response. So it was open-ended. They were going to take calls from any quarterback in the country that was interested. Mm-hmm. And but finding the kid who's leaving a third or fourth string job somewhere else and coming into a new school for the same thing was going to be next to impossible. Finding a potential starter to come in who sees 2 guys, one is Max Johnson, they brought in right away last November, and the other one is a dude who's in his 3rd year in the program. A lot of potential starters, unless you're Arch Manning, you're going to look at that and say, no way, I'm already leaving something like that. So Mac was looking for a needle in a haystack, and he found it.
Yeah.
His name is Jacoby Criswell. Jacoby gives Carolina exactly what it needs in that room. Carolina gives Jacoby exactly what he needs at this point in his life. It is a perfect match. Kudos to Mac. Kudos to Jacoby for having the fortitude and the courage to make a move like that, because you knew it was going to be criticized by some people just because that's the way the world is now. But it is a great pickup, because whether or not he competes for a job, you've got an older guy who's got his degree, and he didn't get his initial degree from Carolina. He got it from Arkansas, who's in that room, and he understands what he's going into. So it's not like you have to worry about one of your backups getting an itchy trigger and leaving at any time. He's there for the duration. So this is a great move for Carolina.
Agreed. No, I think you hit the nail on the head with that needle in a haystack. And I think Mac, he found it. It was a bullseye for him, and makes a ton of sense. Bringing a guy back in that room, like you said, wants to be there for the right reasons and isn't going anywhere. So no, I agree. It was a little bit of a surprise when it happened, just because you don't see this happen very often, at least in Carolina, with a guy leaving and kind of coming back, especially at the quarterback position. But again, no, I think it's exactly what the Tar Heels needed at that position, especially as a backup. But let's dive into the other 3 guys that Carolina landed in the portal. Start with Joshua Harris. I know he's a defensive lineman transfer from Ole Miss. Previously was at State for most of his career as well. Coming in, and again, we'll talk about the 2 other linemen that Carolina landed in the portal as well. But Mac talked about it, maybe a month or so ago, saying, we're looking for a quarterback, we're looking for a running back, and we're looking for some linemen on both lines of scrimmage. And I think Carolina basically got all that. with what they were looking for. So talk to me a little bit about Joshua Harris, because again, experienced guy, played in the ACC for a number of years, played in the state of North Carolina for a number of years, understand what it takes to play at this level. Played a good amount at Ole Miss last year. Didn't have outstanding numbers by any means, but did play a lot at Ole Miss last season too. So I think bringing a guy like in, for at least for me, bringing a guy like in like Joshua Harris, just adds some much needed depth down there, but it also adds a guy that's played a ton of football and has a ton of experience down there as well. So somewhat local guy from Roxborough too. So it makes a ton of sense. So I think, again, Joshua Harris, at least in my opinion, is a really good addition to that defensive lineman room, especially when you look at who's down there and some of the younger guys that still need to step up at that position and solidify themselves as starters. So do you kind of agree with that, Harris, adds depth and probably will be a guy that I would expect to play a good amount as well?
Yeah, he's what I call a snap eater.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to eat up some snaps for him. They would love to see Joel Starlings and Rodney Laura become those guys, but both of them are kind of ahead of schedule. When I talk to some people around the program, they did not, especially Starlings, who had a really good fall, a really good spring. They didn't expect them to be close to being ready just yet, but they probably aren't ready just yet. So they needed someone that could bridge that gap. Now, maybe they are at some point next season, but they needed a snap eater. They didn't need a starter. They've got starters. They've got some experience up front. Kevin Hester's played a lot of football. Ritzy, a lot of football. Evans, a lot of football. Now, Harris is an inside guy. He's a 4 technique guy. And they needed someone that could do that, because as much as Travis Shaw's game has grown and Travis Shaw himself has grown, and those two things are going hand in hand there, until Travis can give them 40 snaps a week and play well and not ebb and flow like this, they needed to fortify that spot. So Joshua Harris does that for him. He's a snap eater. You need snap eaters. Mm-hmm. And, in baseball, you got to have that long relief guy every once in a while that in a 10-2 game can give you a few innings without killing the rest of the bullpen. I think that a guy like Joshua Harris is sort of like a long relief type guy along the front line. He could give them needed snaps that during the course of the game for depth purposes and to give the regulars in the rotation breather, and he'll be in the rotation. But also, if you're in a situation where it's lopsided, maybe he gets extra run there so you don't wear down and wear out some of the regular starters. Because I do believe that this team, part of the reason they've collapsed the last few years is because they've worn down.
Yeah,
they've collapsed 3 straight years. Even the team 2 years, Sam's last year was terrible at the end of the year. Mm-hmm. This program has gotten tired. That's one of the problems. And Mac said again last week, we always talk about building depth and then we never do it.
Yeah.
I mean, he points the arrow at himself and the staff, and that's true. Getting a Joshua Harris is part of building that depth. He's a kid that knows he's not coming in and starting. Kind of like Jacoby Criswell, he understands that he has a role coming in and he's embraced the role. And by the way, that's 2 former NC State players now on the roster. Mm-hmm. And they will both be in the rotation. Mm-hmm. Jakeem Harris might start.
Mm-hmm. A lot of experience, especially bringing in those guys from state. And I like that. I mean, I think we talk about it in basketball some, but in football too. I think it's very important to bring in guys that have played at the ACC level. That for me is incredibly important. I think it adds some of that familiarity that maybe isn't there when a guy, Elijah Hudge's not a good example because he was so good for Carolina, but came from a different level of college football. You can definitely go get guys like that, and Carolina's done a good job at doing that at times. But again, when you can bring in guys that have played in the ACC and have a lot of experience in that, maybe not necessarily to start, like you said, maybe they will, you never know what happens, but just bringing guys to have that backup and that rotation and that experience, that's what, like you said, Carolina's just been majorly lacking. Depth, we've talked about it a lot, just has not been developed. So kudos to Mac for coming out and saying that, because I have talked to a lot of fans, and that has always been a major frustration amongst fans is they tell us every spring that they're going to build depth and they've got all this depth. And then by the 3rd, 4th game of the year, it's just the same guys playing over and it comes back to bite them. So
and part of that's
with that.
For example, after a game, if Mac gets a question about why didn't such and such play more? He doesn't really get that kind of question, but sometimes the inference in the question is that, and he'll say, I don't know, I have to talk to a position coach. Because ultimately the position coaches are the head coaches of those rooms. And they determine play times. Not like Max says, hey, let's get such and such on the field now. Now he might say that sometimes, and he's in those conversations in the headset all the time, and he'll suggest plays, or generally speaking, he'll veto things. Or fourth down, he may say, hey, let's go ahead and go for this. But the position coaches put guys out there. And position coaches, football coaches in general, are the most paranoid bunch of people I've ever dealt with in my life. I mean, that's why they are so protective over who sees what and what they talk about. And every one of them thinks they're playing the D-Day invasion at all times.
Yeah, I love that analogy, by the way.
And so they're very paranoid. So a lot of times they're not going to put the third best linebacker on the field because they've already got the two best linebackers on the field. Why would I hurt my job, hurt my performance, hurt my room by putting the third guy out there? And that's something I think that they need to change. And that starts at the top. Mac has to be more emphatic about them playing those kids. I believe that they've made that decision. I really do. Now, we'll see if it's backed up during the season, but I heard more about it this spring than I have in past springs. Not just hearing about it, but you could see it. You could see a lot of the rotation on the field during practice. We actually got to see when the ACC network showed up, they just did a practice, right?
Yeah.
We typically Carolina scrimmages on a Saturday. We got to see the scrimmage on Thursday. So we got to see a lot of stuff. And we got to see a lot of how they go about things defensively, schematically, the player rotations, and they were playing a lot of guys. Now, of course, it's April. You can play a lot of guys, but a lot of dudes were getting work, and they were getting a lot of players on film to see who can help out. I do think they are more committed to that. We'll see. If they don't and they collapse, then we know where at least one of the fingers can point to.
Exactly. No, yeah, again, only time will tell. But the messaging coming out, and not just the messaging, because that's always been there, but the things you can see with your own eyes seem to be pointing towards that direction. Again, I think that's a no-brainer when you look at the last three seasons. I mean, you got to change something in that respect, because it is very evident that with the collapses Carolina's had, a lot of that does come down to just the same guys playing all the time. So we'll see again what happens in the season, but positive signs out of the program right now that is something that's going to change. Last two guys we'll talk about before we wrap this pod up. Again, we're going a little bit shorter on this one. Zach Greenberg, Muhlenberg College offensive lineman transfer, a guy that I think a lot of people expect to come in and, he is the most interesting one to me. Ja'Kiah Leftwich from Georgia Tech, a lot of people, and even coming out of the program, that he might come in and very well maybe a starter, at least a guy that's going to play a ton of reps down there. Zach Greenberg maybe being more of a project guy when you just consider the level of football he's coming from and maybe some of the intangibles and whatnot that he brings. So more question marks about him and how he maybe fits in, but again, add some depth in there, and I think that's important. And again, Ja'Kiah Leftwich, I think a guy that a lot of Carolina fans should be excited about, and I think the coaching staff is exciting about, because again, a guy that played and started at a Georgia Tech school and has played a ton of minutes down there as well. That for me is a big positive, especially when you look at some of the question marks still surrounding that offensive line group, something we talked about a lot during the spring and in our post-spring football pod. So thoughts on those two guys? Again, I think the number one thing is they need bodies down there, and I think at least one of those guys is ready-made to come in and potentially be a big-time starter for Carolina.
Well, Leftwich has he's the second most experienced offensive lineman on the team, behind Willie Lampkin, who came in from Coastal Carolina. So I would never judge a player based on where they come from. Jared Verse was at Albany, went to Florida State, and he was a first-round pick. So
good point, yeah.
Yeah. So as far as Leftwich goes, I think one of the tackle spots is his for the taking. It was pretty wild to see Howard Sampson out there running with the blue team every time I saw the team. He's a guy who barely got on the field at North Texas. I know he was banged up a little bit, but that's North Texas. And then you've got Trevion Green, who is continuing in the process of his full transformation from 410 pounds and being told by Mac Brown, we would love to offer you, but we can't. You have to show us you can be more disciplined and you can get your weight down. And he did it. And I think he's someone that has a chance to be really, really good one day.
Mhm.
Is he there yet? I think there was a lot of inconsistency in the spring. Sampson may have been more consistent in the spring, but I think Leftwich is probably going to take one of those spots. The good thing is that a guy like Sampson got a ton of reps in the spring. He got a reps at this level, and he admittedly was overwhelmed by how much bigger football is at North Carolina in terms of the facilities, the expectation, the regimen, everybody that's around you, as opposed to North Texas, which has a solid program. Oh, yeah. I've been to North Texas. I've seen their facilities. They got a nice stadium. They got pretty good facilities, but it's a different animal in the ACC. And so he was a little overwhelmed by that at first. And so he had to kind of work through that. But he did pretty well in the spring. So I think that Leftwich will probably be one of the starters. I would be surprised if he's not. As far as Greenberg goes, he's a guy that they liked a lot. I think that there is there's an element where there's a football player here that no one could see previously because he was in Division III. He just needed to come into this level to have his full game massaged by people at this level, to have this kind of weight program, to be in a program where the dedication is essentially 24/7, unlike at Muhlenberg College. So he's got 2 years. It's unfortunate he couldn't come in the spring. I think he really could have used the spring, but he had to finish up school before he could make the transition, which is the same thing with Leftwich, who did finish school, by the way, and he'll be there in a couple of weeks. Both will. So I think Muhlenberg's a shot in the dark. You got a spot open. You got a lot of linemen in the room. You take a shot in the dark every once in a while at somebody to see what they can give you. They did it with Spencer Rowland, and it worked out pretty well. Yeah. Spencer signed a free agent deal last Sunday. So we'll see. He's a body. He's an experienced guy. He's you can never have enough college graduates. Now that we're still in the COVID era as far as fifth-year players, and I do think the NCAA is going to go to a fifth-year player. The more college graduates you have on your roster, the better. Yeah. Because they're just different kids. They're different. They're not kids anymore. They're dudes. They're men. They're dudes. And they kind of know who they are. And the more you have guys that know who they are, the better your team chemistry is going to be. And team chemistry is enormous in both sports, as we've seen in basketball just the last 2 years. And you had a lot of dudes who knew who they were in basketball, right? Mm-hmm. I think right now in football, they have a roster of guys that know who they are. When Max says it reminds him of 2 years ago when no one was talking about them and they start out 9-1, they had a lot of players that knew who they were, where they were in that time in their careers and where their careers were headed. I think they have a lot of that right now.
Agreed. No, I completely agree with that. And again, I think that's a good place to wrap this one up. We could sit here talking about Carolina football for the next hour. But again, I think this one hitting on roster retention, the guys that have brought in with the portal closing early this week on Tuesday night, we'll obviously do more drops related to football and another UNC football show over the next, couple weeks as well as things start to develop and things start to change. So AJ, appreciate it on this one. Good stuff on this quick edition of the UNC football show, which I think is good. We do a lot of these. They're like 45 minutes to an hour off-season content, trying to go a little bit shorter, quick hitting stuff, especially with the drop. So I think this one fits in nicely with that. I've been Jacob Turner. He's been Andrew Jones. Appreciate you guys watching as always. Make sure you head on over to TarHeelIllustrated.com, $8.33 a month to sign up. Links in the description below. Come join our awesome community over there. Also helps support everything we do over here, including our YouTube channel. So if you want to support, guys, come sign up, and you also get a ton of extra content and insider information for doing it. So everybody wins in that situation. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like the video below, subscribe, tell your friends about us as well. Trying to continue to grow as an organization, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.